Hi, everyone, and welcome to a new episode in our show, Conversation Time with. I'm so excited to introduce to you today's guest, Kaminie Wood. Kaminie is a certified life coach and much else besides. As a life coach, Kaminie helps her client lead happier and more fulfilled lives by helping them work on their mindset and behavior. For example, one of the issues that Kaminie often talks about in her work is how our need to please others often leads to self-inflicted pressure, stress, and anxiety. Kaminie is here today to talk to us about how we can rediscover our inner strength to build confidence, improve communication, set healthy boundaries, and ultimately have better relationships. So a huge welcome to you, Kaminie. I'm very excited to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for agreeing to speak with us, Kaminie. Now, before we get into our main topic, I have to ask you a question about your family, because I read that you're a mom of 5. So as a mother myself, I have to ask you, how old are your children?
My oldest is 20. She's a professional ballerina. She dances with a ballet company up in upstate New York. And then my second oldest is turning 18 in a couple months, and he is going to be headed off to college next year. And then I have a 15-year-old daughter, a 12-year-old son, and then my youngest is an 8-year-old girl.
Wow, congratulations and hats off to you, Kaminie. Now let's talk about life coaching. A very simple question. What is life coaching and who is it for?
So life coaching is really about helping people become generative, meaning help them figure out what goals they would like to set for themselves, identify what obstacles might be in the way, and work with them on figuring out ways to achieve those specific goals. With that, my spin on life coaching is about recognizing that everything comes back to the relationship with the self. And I know we're going to dive into that with the concept of self-love coaching. But my belief is that everything is tied into having a solid foundational relationship with self. When we have that, then we're able to identify what our passions are, what brings us joy, where we want to go in terms of those goals. And so then it's about helping my clients figure out what steps and what action items they're going to take to reach those goals.
Okay, so talk us through how it works, Kaminie. Let's say I come to you as a client and I say, Kaminie, please, I need your help. Please, will you be my life coach? What would the next steps be?
Well, oftentimes people want to fix that surface level issue, meaning I can't figure out, what career I want, which is, yes, it is an issue that we would need to deal with. But the very first thing that I would start to dive into is what's beneath that. What is going on? What's the self-talk that's happening? What does bring you joy and happiness? What are the things that fill you up? Because when we get underneath that surface level issue, that's when we can start making commitments to moving into what we truly want.
Yeah, it's interesting you said what's beneath that. So I imagine with things like procrastination, for example, if I'm always procrastinating on one specific issue or maybe on everything, you would help me look at kind of the underlying beliefs perhaps that are causing my procrastination.
I think many people will often complain about being a procrastinator, and they'll just say, I'm just a procrastinator. That's just a label. It's a way that we've sort of been able to almost make it quote unquote better and more palatable, if you will. And really what our work is about and the work that I do with my clients is understanding what is behind the procrastination. Oftentimes there's some type of fear or some type of false belief that might be hanging out behind the scenes that keeps you from moving forward.
Yeah, fear of failure comes to mind, but also like the false belief perhaps that we're not deserving, which leads me nicely to my next question, which is about self-love coaching, because you are a self-love coach. And my question is, what is self-love coaching and how is it different from life coaching?
It's a part of the life coaching that I do. Really what self-love coaching is about is learning to actually honoring oneself, loving oneself, and learning how to be self-compassionate. Oftentimes it's a lot easier to be compassionate to others than it is to ourselves. But when we really break it down, when we are not compassionate to ourselves, when we don't honor ourselves, and we don't take the time to actually recognize who we are, what our value systems are, what our gifts are, what ends up happening is we are putting ourselves and speaking to ourselves in a negative way. And that negativity keeps us stuck in a box, and we're not able to grow into what we're actually, capable of, or what we really would want to grow into. And so essentially, without that self-love, we are keeping ourselves stuck. So I truly believe in really bringing a light and shining a light onto this concept of how do we self-love? It's a muscle that we have to build from, in order to move forward without being able to truly love ourselves. And it's not selfish by any means. It's the term that I use is self-full, because when we actually feel self-full, when we fill ourselves up and we're able to see ourselves and what we have to offer in a positive way, we then can show up in relationship with others from a complete and whole place, whole, WHOLE, not so that you're not looking for somebody else to fill you up. And when we're able to do that, we can actually start creating authentic relationships with others.
I'm glad that you touched on the issue of selfishness, and I love the concept of self-full as opposed to selfish, because I think many people, when they hear that they have to love themselves more, worry about that they kind of have to become more selfish or uncaring towards others. So my question to you, Kاميني, is how can we love ourselves a little bit more without loving others a little bit less?
Well, the first thing I would say is it's the release of what other people think, first of all. When we continually live our lives motivated by something external to ourselves, whether or not somebody else approves of us, that's that very first part of living from the outside in, and we really have to start living from the inside out. The second part of that is it goes back to even how they say on airplanes, put your own oxygen mask on first and then help others. It's because if you can't breathe yourself, how are you supposed to help others? It's the same concept with self-love. If we don't fully know who we are, appreciate who we are, how can we actually engage in full, authentic relationships with others? Because oftentimes what ends up happening is we'll turn ourselves inside out to be what we think the other person wants us to be. And in turn, that either creates toxic relationship dynamics, or it creates just ineffective and inauthentic connection with the other person, because we're not truly who we are from the inside. And so when we break that down and we recognize, and I come from the Indian background, so I understand the cultural norms of, you should give. If you don't give, then you must be selfish. It's breaking that down and saying, when I love myself, when I see my value and worth, I actually can give more to others. When I don't see my worth and my value, I'm actually not able to give to others in a full and authentic way.
Yeah, this reminds me of a situation when my eldest daughter was a tiny, tiny baby. She would cry a lot, and one day she was crying so much and wouldn't stop. So I took her to the doctor, and the doctor kind of like took a quick look at her and said, the baby is fine. And then she looked at me and said, how are you? And this is when it really like hit home. This is when it dawned on me that for my baby to be fine, I had to be fine, and that for me to be able to take care of my baby, I had to first take care of myself.
Absolutely. I actually really love that your doctor or your daughter's doctor did that. Yeah. I actually had an opposite experience. My very first child was having trouble nursing, and I took her to the doctor. She was same thing, very constantly upset, constantly just crying all the time. And the pediatrician looked at me and said, what are you doing wrong? Oh. And I remember that because only after I went to a different doctor and she did something similar to what your doctor did and said, well, let's take care of you first. Yeah. And I started becoming calm, and I started figuring out, where I was feeling exhausted and overwhelmed, took care of that. It ended up helping my daughter. It turns out my daughter had really bad reflux and needed medication to help with that. But when I was able to deal with what was happening for me and my stress levels and bring that back down, when I was calmer, my daughter ended up being calmer as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That totally resonates. Now, earlier on, you mentioned that you are from an Indian heritage. So you've got the Indian culture, and I'm from a Middle Eastern culture. So are our viewers, they're either Middle Eastern or North African. So Arabic culture, like Indian culture, is very collectivist, and we care a lot about our relationships with others, even with the wider community. So how can we set healthy boundaries without upsetting everyone around us? I mean, we need the wider community, we need people around us, we need the relationship to others. How can we live better with others while at the same time having healthy boundaries?
And you're absolutely right, because we're as humans, we're relational beings. We actually need community. But it's important to look at boundaries as more like fences and not walls. So when we are setting boundaries, we're not putting up a wall with other people. We're simply putting up a fence. You can look through fences. Fences can be moved, but it is important to have those stabilized and erected, so to speak, so that we know where we are, like our own space, and where somebody else begins. Meaning, their opinion does not create who we are. How we talk to ourselves, how we see ourselves, is where the foundation is. And in society and in certain cultures, it is really predominant to look at, well, how am I being portrayed? How do they see me? And we can't get away from that. We can't just escape it and pretend it doesn't exist. However, it's really important to, it's that self-talk. It's recognizing when somebody has an opinion, we can actually say, that's their opinion of me, and what do I know to be true about myself? When we get to that place, that's how we can continue to move forward. When we are driven by what other people think, it's external to us. Therefore, when that shifts or changes, our foundation shifts or changes. So if we think of ourselves like a house, we need our foundation to be solid so that we can withstand any challenge that comes through life. If we are dependent on an external force or external people to determine our worth, for instance, that foundation is very shaky. So when the challenges of life come at us, that house is not necessarily going to be able to withstand that, because we're not in control of what other people's opinions are.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I also love the concept of having a movable fence as opposed to building a fixed wall. I also love what you said about not allowing other people's opinions to define who we are, or to destabilize our own perception of who we are. And this segues into my next question, which is about social media, where, of course, a lot of our interactions have moved. So, often when we post something on social media, we kind of like sit back and wait for the comments and likes to come in. And sometimes when they don't come in, we kind of like throws us off balance. Or worse still, if someone makes a nasty comment, that can be really kind of destabilizing for a lot of people. It can really crush some people. So how can we protect ourselves from getting caught up in the validation game on social media?
So social media, you can love it or you can hate it, and you can do both. I do have a love-hate relationship with it, I will be honest. I think the very first thing with social media is I often say to people, have some boundaries around just how much time you're going to be on social media. When we allow ourselves to endlessly scroll, we can get really caught up in the comparison mode or the comparison mentality. It's also important to just keep in mind that that's a snippet of somebody's day or life. I often will refer to it as it's almost like the curbside appeal, right? Where the outside of the house looks beautiful, prim and proper, but you have no idea what's happening behind those closed doors. It's just, and it's not to say that everybody who posts these beautiful pictures have something going on behind the scenes. It's simply to just remember we don't actually know the whole story, because social media just gives us that snippet of time. And so again, it goes back to this question of, what do I know to be true? And it goes back to, what do I know to be true about my own world and what's happening for me, rather than getting caught up in comparing our story to somebody else's that we're seeing on social media, because our story is ours and their story is theirs, and allowing those things to be separate and not think that they need to be the same by any stretch of the imagination. But I do believe in limiting the amount of time we spend on social media, because I do think that it can be a dark hole if we allow ourselves to fall into it.
Yeah, I often compare spending too much time on social media to digging a big hole and throwing all of your precious time into it. But you know what's funny, Kامini, is when you are scrolling on social media and you see those images and you know that they're fake or they don't completely reflect reality, you still end up feeling worse about yourself sometimes. So you know that they're not real, but they still make you feel bad about yourself. So why does that happen? And how can we stop ourselves from getting caught up in that?
Yeah, I think it's just that pull of comparison. It's an internal distraction that happens where we just naturally are wanting to see where we size up against somebody else. I mean, it's sort of how self-esteem and self-confidence are positioned. They're positioned to say, hey, where do I size up in comparison to the larger population? And that's why self-compassion is so important in the scheme of, I always talk about self-esteem, self-confidence, and self-compassion all together rather than just esteem and confidence, because compassion is about recognizing it's self-kindness over self-judgment. That's number one. Number two is you're not isolated. There's this concept of common humanity. So other people have had similar experiences to what you're going through, and we can seek out support from that perspective. And then, of course, mindfulness, which is being in the present moment. So when we're on social media, what ends up happening is we get pulled into this comparison mode. Where do I measure up? And that's why it's so important to take into the consideration self-compassion, where we recognize once we start comparing ourselves, if judgment comes in, it's about dialing that back and recognizing, how can I be kind to myself? Would I say this statement that I'm saying to myself right now to my best friend or to a loved one? And that's how we can dial back that pull into the comparison mentality.
Yeah, stop the comparison and have self-compassion, be kind to yourself. I absolutely love that. Now, Kامini, I think that's all of my questions. Is there anything else that we should have spoken today that we haven't spoken about, or would you like to add anything else about self-love or any other issue?
The only other thing that I would love to share is just this concept of recognizing that when we are talking about self-love and self-compassion, it is about taking some time to recognize how we talk to ourselves. That I would say is the key element, because oftentimes we don't catch how we speak to ourselves. And if we can become more cognizant and aware of how we're speaking to ourselves, that's when we can really start to own it. We acknowledge it, we accept that that's there. We don't psychoanalyze it, but it's just about, now once we're aware of it, what aligned action are we going to take?
Yeah, so stop the negative self-talk too. Now, Kامini, we'll link to your website, kaminiwood.com, and your Instagram and Facebook pages. Is there any other place you would like us to point our audience to in order to connect with you directly?
No, website, Facebook, Instagram. And I just want to say thank you so much for having me on here with you today.
Well, thank you, Kامini, for being such a brilliant guest and for a great conversation. Everyone, I hope you've enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did. If you know anyone who may be interested in today's topic, make sure to share this video with them. If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel yet, make sure to subscribe and also follow me on Facebook. Leave me a comment with your thoughts about today's conversation, or if you have any questions. Also, make sure to join me again next week for a new lesson in which we're going to look at some of the key words and expressions heard in today's conversation. Until then, I'll see you on the Facebook page and on the YouTube channel. And thanks again for watching. Bye, everyone. Bye.